I want to start out with an apology. The title is a little different than what I negotiated with Dr. Dura when we first discussed my participation at this conference. I talked about, I was going to give you an academic paper with a rather roundabout theme, but I decided after some conversations with him and with others that I would just go straight to the point. So I'll talk a little more about the items which were mentioned in the abstract you were given, but the last couple of lines of that. And what I want to discuss, excuse me a second, I just try this again, see which one works. That's better. I want to discuss a very concrete manifestation of secularization that now very much dominates the public debates in the West and is rapidly expanding here to East Central Europe. It's as the referendum which is coming up here in Romania on same-sex marriage indicates. It's the concept. It's the extent to which it's the increasing growth of sexual ideology in the Western world, and this is something which I think is not taken maybe sometimes with complete seriousness here in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, where sexual radicalism is in its infancy, and where the church is still a very strong advocate of traditional values. And sometimes maybe people here in Central Europe wonder what all the fuss is about. And even in the West, I think in many ways, there's great misunderstanding about the advent of sexual ideology. And even those Christian groups, NGOs and others that are opposing it, sometimes misunderstand the full import of what exactly is taking place. What we're dealing with here is not simply a deterioration of the culture. It is something that has very serious consequences for freedom and for democracy, as some of the speakers have indicated. The aspect of secularization that I want to talk about today is very much the component of a political ideology. My field is politics, and from my point of view, secularization is part of a quite decided and deliberate political agenda. I don't deny that this is part of a larger trend towards secularization in culture, but I think sometimes that the politics and the political elites that dictate the political agenda often have a role in the culture, in dictating the culture as well. As the cliche goes, politics is sometimes upstream from culture rather than the other way around. The avant-garde today of political secularization in the Western world is a radical political ideology that seeks to gain political power by controlling the terms of the family and of sexuality. It is not, therefore, simply a matter of an impersonal matter of secularization, an inevitable process. It is something that is very much part of a deliberately being pushed agenda by certain elites. I think and what I want to emphasize is this is not a spontaneous phenomenon. It is something that is quite political, has very concrete manifestations, but at the same token, I hope to introduce an aspect of hope in this, because I think by the same measure, it's something that has the possibility that if we start looking at this as a political ideology and a political agenda, it is something that offers the possibility of effective opposition. This is not something we can just throw up our hands and say it's the culture, there's nothing we can do about this. There's very concrete steps we can take. And I want to outline some of those for you here today. I think that one of the striking things about this agenda of sexual radicalism that we're seeing throughout the Western world is that we are losing in many ways. Christian groups and other religious believers are losing ground very quickly. And you're probably familiar, of course, with issues like same-sex marriage, or, of course, the referendum that's coming up here in Romania very soon, issues like abortion, issues like sex education. What's common throughout many of these is we see this process of Christian beliefs being denigrated and Christians losing these polemical battles. And this is taken as some kind of inevitable or inexorable process of secularization. I don't think it's anything of the kind. I think we're just going about this the wrong way. So I hope that the points that I raise here, the approach that I want to advocate taking toward this, is something that could be of assistance to us. And I want to start out with a quotation from a recent book by Gabriela Kubi, The Global Sexual Revolution. And one of the most pithy statements in the book is where she says that the abandonment of Christian sexual morality is the core of the church's self-secularization. It's complicated statements. I'll read it again. Abandonment of Christian sexual morality is the core of the church's self-secularization. It's quite striking how the speed with which, in the Western world today, the political agenda has been dominated by what Newsweek magazine calls the politics of sex. Demands to recognize, again, same-sex marriage, legalized abortion, and so forth, are a small part of this. There's much more to this iceberg than just the tip that is on the media radar screen. What we are seeing today, I believe, is the expansion of a new political ideology, something similar to socialism, to nationalism, to fascism, the ideologies that we've heard about earlier in the day. What we're seeing here is a radical ideology. It takes various forms. The oldest form is feminism, of course. The more recent form is what some people now call homosexualism. Helen Alvarez, a prominent lawyer in the United States, calls this sexualityism. Okay, in other words, the advocacy of sexual liberalism as a political ideology. And the ubiquitous terms like power and empowerment are an indication that what we're talking about here is not just freedom, it's power. And there's a certain authoritarian aspect to this, which I think has been very strongly underestimated. One sympathetic scholar calls it, quote, the ideology of the erotic. And they're using the old term social justice is replaced by terms like, quote, erotic justice. Okay? These ideologies began with very reasonable terms. Feminism claimed to begin with equality with men. Homosexualism began with simply the right to be left alone in private, something which most of us would sympathize with. I believe that these apparent reasonable liberal positions are in fact an optical illusion. There's much more here. There's a Pandora's box of urges that are being released, sexual urges and urges toward political power, both of which are, it is no accident, insatiable. We are seeing here not only the desire for freedom, but we are seeing the rationalization of political power and the rationalization of punishment of people who fall afoul of this agenda. In other words, the mobilization of the criminal justice system, the law, with the penal apparatus to punish people who, for various reasons, fall afoul of this agenda. And it's striking how far the political agenda generally, in many different areas of life, is being dominated in the world today by sexuality and the family. To some extent, I include that too. The historian Philip Jenkins says, most of the reasons for the differences, he puts it in religious terms, most of the reasons for the differences between the Christianity of the affluent countries and the poor involve disputes over gender and sexuality. These have proved the defining issues, quotation, defining issues that separate progressives from conservatives, ecclesiastical left and ecclesiastical right. The same is true, obviously, of secular left and secular right. But the fact that he mentions the religious dimension, I think, is very, very important. There's several dimensions of this phenomenon that I want to just briefly mention, even though I can't do it in detail. One manifestation is the controversies over religious freedom, which we heard about this morning from Bill Saunders. But it is quite striking today how that there's a direct confrontation increasingly between religious freedom and sexual freedom. Almost all the major controversies and restrictions today on religious freedom involve the family and sexuality. Just about every one that Bill Saunders mentioned, or I could give you a list of them here today, they almost all involve this. Registrars refusing to officiate same-sex marriage, Catholic adoption agencies being put out of business because of their religious principles. Homeschoolers, you could even include, have lost their children to school authorities who are pushing an increasingly sexualized agenda. Even the Obamacare, the American healthcare system that we heard about this morning, is really in some ways much more about sexuality than it is about healthcare. It involved contraception and abortion, and the main lobby in favor of it was very strongly pushing single-parent homes. So it's quite striking. We're not really talking about healthcare at all. We're talking about a radical sexual agenda. And this is being recognized increasingly, even in the United Nations. It's like Christianity today is under pressure from a form of secularism, especially in Europe. This form of prejudice against Christians or ideas based on religion, which exists both in Europe and the United States, mainly concerns, quote, questions relating to sex, marriage, and the family, on which the Catholic, Muslim, and Orthodox churches have taken stands. So this is being recognized increasingly in the world today. Another United Nations committee said, in all countries, the most significant factors inhibiting women's ability to participate in public life have been the cultural framework of values and religious beliefs. Okay? Strikingly, a public official in the United States, a government official, a paid federal official in the United States, recently recognized this, that there's a direct confrontation increasingly today between sexual freedom and religious freedom. And this public official said, quote, "I'm having a hard time coming up with any case in which religious liberty should win." Okay? There can be a conflict between religious liberty and sexual liberty, but in all cases, sexual liberty should win. This is a US government official saying this. So one manifestation of this is in the area of religious freedom. But it's not just religious freedom, it's secular freedom as well, is also under threat from this radical ideology. One of the areas, and again, we're dealing here with a very, very strongly authoritarian ideology. One of the most areas that is off the radar screen, even the radar screen of Christian groups in the Western world, but one of the most authoritarian areas of the political machinery in the West has to do with divorce. The machinery that governs divorce in the United States and in Britain and increasingly other countries, Australia, Canada, and other countries as well, is probably the most repressive government machinery that has ever been created in the Anglophone countries. And I don't say that lightly. It is in many ways a purpose-built mechanism for dismembering families and seizing control of the private lives of innocent people, including their children, of course, and confiscating their property, and in many cases even incarcerating them without trial. The oxymoron of no-fault divorce has completely revolutionized the legal systems, certainly in the Anglophone countries and well beyond. I can give you examples of this. And allowing innocent people, citizens who are not charged with any crime, to be summarily evicted from their homes, separated from their children, plundered for everything they have, and in some cases even incarcerated without trial. This next quotation here, I just happen to have a quotation from a Romanian dissident who settled in the United States after years under communism. His name is Mihai Musat, and he said that under Nicolae Ceausescu, he had been arrested for a protest, and he said, "I was sentenced to 2 months in prison in communist Romania, but at least I got to appear in court and talk to the judge. That's more than I got in American family court." Okay. So the divorce machinery is one of the areas where the government is one of the most repressive areas of government machinery. But this is only the beginning in many ways. One of the most disturbing examples is also very almost invisible on the political radar screen of the Western world, and that's a vast panoply of what I refer to as new crimes and expanded definitions of existing crimes, or what I sometimes call gender crimes. And there's a whole series of these that have emerged in the Western world over the last few decades. And just to give you a brief rundown of them, and only recently have any of these been challenged in the media or among academics. But a kind of litany of these is one, rape and sexual assault, sexual harassment, domestic violence, bullying, stalking, child abuse, sex trafficking, and there's many more examples of this. The striking thing about these, they're all described using highly inflammatory language, but the language has almost no relation to the reality. Rape, for example, that clearly includes consensual sex, and in most cases is nothing more than that. Domestic violence that involves no violence, or any physical contact, or any threat of physical contact. Child abuse that involves simple parental discipline, or in some cases homeschooling by parents who homeschool their own children, or in some cases it's concocted altogether simply to win advantage in divorce courts. Bullying is another example of a new crime that has no definition. Mostly the accused are children, adolescents, or even young children. Stalking is another crime that has no definition. Oftentimes it's simply divorced fathers trying to see their children. In a rare scholarly investigation, Marie Gottschalk found that exploding prison populations in the United States resulted not from conservative law and order campaigns, but from feminist campaigns on rape and domestic violence. The women's movement, this is a quotation, the women's movement became the vanguard of conservative law and order politics. Women's organizations played a central role in the consolidation of these conservative victims' rights movements that emerged in the 1970s. these new crimes have had a striking impact on the law enforcement and the legal system. They've politicized law enforcement, they've rendered the law vague and subjective, they often bypass due process protections for the accused, and they've criminalized and sometimes incarcerated large numbers of men and some women who had no idea that they were committing a crime. These crimes have no definition. They're very fluid. They can amount to almost anything. They are seldom adjudicated in standard courts. There's a whole series of new courts that have been created to adjudicate them. Judges, they're often adjudicated by non-judges, by lawyers in black robes. Judges, surrogates, they're called. Lawyers, social workers, school administrators, campus tribunals, in other words, university ad hoc pseudo courts created in universities, and sometimes welfare officials. So they're not adjudicated in the regular courts by regular judicial officials. The accused are often described as, accusers are often described in literature, in official government documents, as victims. The accused are often described in official government documents as perpetrators, abusers, batterers, bullies, harassers, deadbeats, and so forth. Okay. Oftentimes the crime is described in very vague terms like abuse and exploitation, that again has no definition and does not necessarily even involve anything criminal. In some cases, the crime is defined as the accuser feeling, quote, offended, which means that effectively the accused is guilty by definition. And this is an area that is spread throughout the law. Proceedings are often rigged with what are called victim advocates, which are usually professional accusers who have no first-hand knowledge of the alleged crime in order to secure conviction and maximum punishment. So these are, and yet the accused are given no equivalent advocates to testify for them. And oftentimes the accused are not even given the opportunity to speak on their own behalf. Government campaigns, paid government campaigns exist to, what they say, raise awareness. In other words, propaganda campaigns to convince people that there are large numbers of criminals in their midst, even though nobody's actually witnessed any crime or seen any evidence of any actual criminality. Accusers are often certified as victims by civil servants or by welfare agencies without any judicial procedure at all. In some cases, there's not even a record of the incarceration. In other words, the accused are incarcerated not only without charge and without conviction, they're incarcerated with no record of the fact that they are incarcerated. This is contrary to law in the United States, of course, and in most other free societies. The striking thing, too, about these crimes is they encounter almost no opposition. Very few people are willing to place themselves in a position of appearing to condemn sex crimes or to accuse sex offenders. Oftentimes the accused are left on their own because everybody wants to distance themselves from someone who's accused of rape or child abuse or so forth. So there's a kind of spiral of silence by scholars and journalists and other presumed watchdogs. And even conservatives, who are the natural opponents of the feminist and homosexualist lobbies, they too often jump on the bandwagon and add their voices to the radical mob, using language like sexual harassment, and they accuse liberal politicians like Bill Clinton of sexual harassment, or they accuse Muslims of homophobia, right? So rather than using traditional Christian language, rather than talking about fornication or adultery or cohabitation or so forth, what do? They invoke newfangled sexualized political jargon like sexual harassment, homophobia, and so forth. So these words, this language, this politicized ideological language enters our vocabulary, and what does it do? It displaces our traditional morality. So we don't talk about fornication or adultery anymore. We talk about sexual harassment and homophobia. You see? So this use of the language has an impact on our morality. And basically, I think what it's doing in many ways is replacing our morality, traditional Christian morality, with political ideology in ways that we are not even, oftentimes not even conscious of happening. Another area that I think that this manifests itself, this ideology, And this, again, I can only talk about this very briefly, but I want to at least raise it here as something to think about, because I know that this is a kind of no-go area in Europe. But all of this reflects very much a large increase in government power, government scope and power, the increase of the criminal justice system, increasing police power, increasing quasi-police power among kind of quasi-police social workers who effectively have police power, even though we don't call them police, and they don't wear uniforms, and they're not required to be restrained with the regular due process procedures that we usually normally expect of police. But one area, many of these developments that I've mentioned have their origins in the welfare state. And the welfare state is, after all, was in its inception, a very bold expansion of government power into areas of family life in ways that I think we're only now being conscious of, that we're only now coming to grips with how this has happened. The welfare state is not only a huge growth of government power which takes care of us in many ways from the cradle to the grave. It also involves it has its own, as I mentioned, its own gendarmeries. It has its own police forces, which very few scholars, very few journalists ever scrutinize, ever look at. Most of the social pathologies that in our society today, the growth of government power, the growth of government in many ways, has its origins in the welfare communities that are created, they're created in many ways. The rationalization for creating the welfare state and the welfare communities is the growth of single-parent homes. But the striking thing about the welfare state is it creates the very problems that it's intended to solve, that is to say, single-parent homes. Single-parent homes, in turn, provide most of the justification for things like budgets for law enforcement, incarceration, education, healthcare, and other social services. Because the expenditures for the welfare state are actually, huge as they are, and they're quite enormous, are actually quite small compared to the multiplier effect that the welfare state creates. In other words, the welfare state is a kind of government's self-expanding engine for creating social problems for itself to solve. In other words, most of the social pathologies of our society, crime, truancy, substance abuse, all of these are traceable directly to single-parent homes, fatherless homes, which are basically welfare communities. In recent years, even terrorism is traceable in many ways to single-parent homes and welfare immigrant communities. Not because they're immigrant communities, but because they're welfare communities. Because they're single-parent homes where there's no father present. So in other words, most government spending, most domestic government spending is directly attributable in many ways to the welfare state. I'm not the only person that's pointed this out, by the way. Other scholars have pointed this out in a number of ways. You could also argue, and again, I can't go into the many manifestations of this, but you could also argue that in many ways the radical sexual agenda is also turning the armed forces, for example, in many ways, into a gargantuan welfare state, aren't they? The benefits of the armed forces, the generous benefits that the armed forces provide, of course, are for a specific purpose, and they're intended for traditional families. And yet what they do in many cases, they act as a magnet for single-parent homes and single parents and others. And they in many ways, it's a vast expansion of the welfare state into areas that we never intended. In many ways, too, the agenda for economic development, our aid budget for overseas economic development, is also been radically transformed by sexual political ideology. How is that? Well, since 1989, since the fall of communism in Central Europe, Marxist ideology has been largely discredited in much of the world. It's no longer respectable to articulate Marxist ideology in many of the academies in the world. So what's happened in the aid budgets, in the overseas, in the literature on economic development, is that the Marxist ideology has been replaced largely by feminist ideology, and increasingly under the Obama administration and in Europe as well, has been replaced by homosexualist ideology. In other words, my point is that sexual ideology has replaced Marxist ideology in much of the much of the academic literature. And one place where this is especially had a very strong impact is on the budgets, is in the budgets for overseas aid. The United Nations, the European Union, all of these are rationalized by budget. Overseas aid budgets are almost entirely targeted toward women or women and children, and increasingly the homosexual lobby is jumping on the same bandwagon. So it's my point is that the aid budget, the overseas aid budget, has also become radically sexualized in many ways. In the global south, one of the striking examples of this, again, I just mentioned it, one of the striking examples of this is the AIDS epidemic, which has been politicized and exacerbated by sexual ideologies. There's a striking book by Edward Green of the Harvard School of Public Health, who has pointed this out. He points out the way the radical sexual lobby, the feminist groups and the homosexuals groups, have politicized the AIDS issue by replacing effective programs on abstinence and fidelity, in other words, and replacing them with budgets that are almost entirely based on condom distribution. The case study that he deals with and others have used in vote is Uganda. In Uganda, they had a very effective AIDS program for a number of years based on abstinence and fidelity that was pushed by the Ugandan government and by Christian organizations. What happened was the homosexual groups came in, and the feminist groups, and they basically eliminated this program. They replaced it with one panacea for solving the AIDS problem: condom distributions. Green, who is a liberal, by the way, and a secularist, calls it this approach was the most egregious backfire in the history of public health, wasting billions of tax dollars and shouldering aside low-cost, low-tech, community-based, culturally grounded strategies that had saved millions of lives. Green calls it the greatest avoidable epidemic in history, and he attributes it to what he calls, this is his term, not mine, sexual ideology. And so other scholars are finding this in other areas, what I'm pointing out here, different areas of public policy. How much time?
5 minutes.
5 minutes? Oh. So, what do we do about this? How do we counter this? This is a very brief overview of this phenomenon. I have to say it's not easy to say what to do. What do we do? How do we counter a new political ideology that's not really on our radar screen, that we don't understand how to deal with? And how do you deal with it from a public policy standpoint? Because by their nature, political ideologies, all of them, increase the power of the state, don't they? Often at the expense of private life. This one does the same thing. So how do you bring this under control? What is the approach? What difference does it make? Well, the most effective mechanisms by which societies encourage, or in some cases impose, sexual restraint are religious. Dennis Altman, who is a homosexual scholar, points out that religion is central to sexual regulation in almost all societies, he says. It may well be that the primary social function of religion, he adds, is to control sexuality. Well, this is very simplistic, obviously, but I think he does point to something very important there. It points to one very concrete avenue by which the decline of faith in the Western world leads directly to the erosion of both social order and civic freedom. When religious restraints are eliminated, other, more political theologies end up filling the vacuum. And again, Altman continues, he says, ironically, those countries which rejected religion in the name of communism tended to adopt their own version of sexual puritanism, okay, which often match those of the religions they assailed. In other words, secular ideologies like communism, they came in and eliminated religion, and yet they imposed their own codes of sexual morality. And since the collapse of communism, I think in some ways we are seeing something quite striking like that. We are seeing increasingly the polarization of the world in sexual terms and, well, oftentimes religious terms, but the terms where they always have a sexual overtone. And the best example of that I have, again, I can't go into this in detail, is the growth of Islamism. Islamism. We don't normally think of Islamism as a sexual ideology, do we? We don't normally we usually think of it as separately. In fact, we think of Islamism as directly counter to feminist ideology and to homosexualist ideology, don't we? We think of them as diametrical opposites. And yet, oddly enough, feminists and homosexualists and other radical left-wingers oftentimes support radical Islamist ideology. They seem to support it, and conservatives have trouble understanding this. Why is this? Well, it's complicated and very hard to explain. But I would argue that the bottom line in both of them is they are both concerned with controlling the terms of sexuality. Because they understand at some level that controlling the terms of sexuality means controlling the society in some ways. So whether you're an Islamist or whether you're a feminist or homosexualist, the bottom line is power. I have a great quote, I don't have it in front of me, by Milovan Djilas, the great Yugoslav communist of the 1950s, who turned against communism. And he said, the bottom line of communism is power. Everything else can be changed, right? Ownership, nationalization, workers' control, all these aspects of everything can be negotiated, right? The bottom line is always power. What communists are really concerned about is power. And you can say the same thing about these ideologies, whether it's homosexualism, feminism, Islamism. The bottom line is always power. And they'll work together if they can, or they'll work separately if they can. And by the way, my limited knowledge of Hindu nationalism that we heard about this morning, I realize there's an element of that too. It's a very strong element, isn't there, of sexualist ideology. As I mentioned, women are involved in Hindu nationalism, feminists included. And there's a very strong kind of masculinist element in the Hindu nationalism itself. Again, I won't go into details because I don't know, I'm not an expert. But this is the striking thing, the striking thought. And I think we need a little more sophisticated way of looking at these things than just than the ways that we've looked at and we were accustomed to in the Cold War. Well, I won't go on any longer. This is really designed to make you think about things in a new way rather than to deal with this topic exhaustively. So I hope that I've at least stimulated some thought, and if you have any questions, of course, I'd be glad to take them.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you indeed for a provocative presentation. We will now take questions, please.